This week's episode of Physio Foundations is part 2 of our chat with Mick Hughes and Randall Cooper from Learn.Physio. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go back and queue that one up for a listen later on, or you could go back and listen now and then come back to this episode where you'll hear all about the introductions that the guys give to their careers and tips for your career development. But let's go straight back into part 2. So in part 2 of this conversation, we're going to dive deeper into Mick and Randall's field of expertise in their wheelhouse, which is ACL injuries and ACL rehabilitation. And we'll also talk about their side projects and the resources that they've developed that you can use to further your knowledge and skills on your own path towards expertise. And if you're interested in ACL rehabilitation, this episode's for you. And just like in part 1, Zuzana, the other half of Perraton.Physio, and the other half is joining us for a panel discussion to add some value. So let's go. Before we run out of time, Mick and Randall, thanks again. Thanks for joining me and Zuzana on part 2 on Physio Foundations.
It's great to be back. Thanks very much, Luke.
Great to be here, Luke and Zuzana. Thanks for having us.
Let's go straight into ACLs and ACL rehab. So we've all got a shared interest in this topic. And if you listen to part 1 of our discussion, you'll have a big introduction to why that is. So Randall first, let's talk about physiotherapy students, young physiotherapists, emerging clinicians. It's something we touched on earlier, but we're talking generally about sports physiotherapy and the pathway and what it's like to be a sports physio. Let's just talk about ACLs here. And what are some of the most important things, the foundational knowledge and skills that you use every day that you couldn't go to work without? So it could be anatomy, physiology, physical examination. It could be questions you ask, communication, anything at all. The floor's open.
Another tough question, Luke. I think that probably, and when you talk to the orthopaedic surgeons about this, they will say that their most important skill that they have is in diagnosing ACLs in the first part is the subjective history, the history of the patient, and asking the right questions. And once you've established that they've had a twisting injury, a giving way episode, usually a snap or crack or pop kind of in the knee has felt unstable before, and you've had some level of effusion or hemarthrosis after it, like nine times out of 10, you're going to have an ACL injury. So you talk to some of the surgeons that have been around for 20 or 30 years, and they'll say, I'll get it, and they're quite arrogant creatures. They'll say that I can predict and understand who's had an ACL or not before I even get my hands on them. So I think understanding the mechanism of injury and getting a good subject history is a massively important skill for young physios to get the right questions going. Then as far as being able to then rehab someone after an ACL injury, I think that Mick and I have put together a criteria called the Melbourne ACL Rehabilitation Guide. We're up to 2.0 at the moment. 3.0 is going to come at some point. But having a plan and having a template that has got some evidence behind it and outcome measures that you can measure progress along the way is super important. A lot of people will get through the first 3 or 4 months of the ACL rehab without too much effort, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, because the knee will settle down, people will start to ride a bike naturally, they'll walk a little bit. But I think that, for most therapists, physios, exercise scientists who work with ACL patients, that second half of the rehab is the most important, and making sure that people do regain full neuromuscular control, full strength, good confidence in their knee, good confidence generally needs to be measured. So having great tests will make sure that you're going through objectively and not just flying blind to get people back to sport at the end of the day.
Mick's chomping at the bit to talk about some of these assessments and outcome measures. So that second part of the rehab where you talked about a lot, Mick, what are some of your I can't go without measurements or tests and baselines that you take?
Yeah, I think there's definitely like a perfect world, I guess, tools and things that you'll have in your toolkit. But I guess the vast majority of clinicians won't have the luxury of having the force plate data. And even some of us may not even have access to handheld dynamometry for some of that late stage testing. So, really it's coming down to finding ways that are pretty low tech that give you high value results. And so, I think for me, I'm lucky enough to work in a clinic with force plates, so I'm gathering counter movement, jump data. I'm looking at how they land left and right, and if their ACL limb is being offloaded in that jump under a double leg task, which is often a common thing we'll see at 6 months, 9 months post-op if it's not trained very well. On the force plates, I'll also get the single leg vertical jump data too, which is starting to show a lot of promise in identifying residual weakness and differences in hop performance, 9, 12 months post-op as well, which often isn't seen in a traditional forward hop test, which is low tech, but gives reasonable good results too. So they're kind of like that's the kind of stuff I'm lucky enough to work with. Having a handheld dynamometry set up also too is really valuable for me as a clinician, because I can measure quite objectively and reliably the quadricep difference between ACL limb and healthy limb. We know the quads have got a huge influence on short-term, medium-term, long-term, very long-term outcomes after an ACL injury. So to be able to objectively measure quad strength is really important to me as a clinician too. So they're kind of like my 2 bits of tech that I probably have grown comfortable with, and I would really struggle to practice the way that I like to practice without. But of course, there are plenty of things that young clinicians can do that don't have the same level of resources as what I'm lucky enough to have at the moment. So even things like a single leg hop for distance, all you need is a measuring tape and a marker. 6 metre timed hop test as well. You just need a stopwatch and a 6 metre distance measured out. Don't overstate also too the importance of a questionnaire, which costs nothing. The IKDC is a very valuable questionnaire that can give you a lot of information about someone's rehab journey and how they're functioning overall at different time points as well through those first 12 months to 2 years. And the ACL-RSI, there's also a really good subjective questionnaire there too. So I think at the back end of rehab, some people can get away simply with, a horizontal hop test battery and a couple of questionnaires to give you some really good objective measures to help you guide someone back to training and back to sport. And if you're lucky enough to work in a really well-resourced clinic with the force plates, Nord board, handheld dynamometry, timing gates, groin bar, force frames, whatever you've got, access to, absolutely utilise some of those extra bells and whistles to really come up with an informed opinion about someone's the safety to return back to training and sport.
Whatever equipment you've got access to, measure,
yeah.
Assess, don't guess.
Yeah, assess, don't guess, but also too, I was having this conversation yesterday with someone up at the Cowboys, and that sometimes there's so much data that can come out of these tests, particularly something like the counter movement jump. It can be analysis, it can be paralysis by analysis. Like you have to really, sometimes you get so much numbers coming your way in a test result that you don't know how to make head or tail of the data. So I think it's important too, as you do get a bit more familiar with these things, probably just pick one or two, maximum 3 data points that you'll choose to look at consistently to see if there's any sort of lingering issues that are occurring within this athlete. So that'll be, the piece of advice there is sometimes, you can get caught up with too many numbers and you just don't know what to do with it. So it's trying to also too, and experience will get you there, years and years of working with multiple ACL athletes, you'll get a good feel of, what is important, what is the important metrics to be looking at in that late stage rehab. But that takes a lot of time and experience to do that.
What about you, Zuzana, with your experience with footy athletes or football players, I should say?
I think Randall and Mick have really rounded it off quite well. I think one of the things that you sort of touched on is really you've got your assess, don't guess, but really make sure that it's objective and subjective. So your objective, you're going to get the numbers, but you want to marry up the numbers to how that person's feeling and their thoughts of, their injury. I mean, one of the biggest things that I'll do when we go out with an athlete to do some drills, etc., is ask them, how do you feel? How confident are you? What does it feel like right now? Because if they say, it doesn't feel great, I'm not going to go straight into that drill. I'll go and see what else we can do to get them that confidence up. So I think you can have a lot of numbers, but if you can't marry it up, and that's where Mick really did quite nicely, talking about some of the patient-reported outcomes, so the questionnaires that you can give them, because the questionnaires are nice because they categorise it, so it's not just pain. There's pain, there's function, sport, even things like work, and understanding not just the demands of, maybe it's sport. Not all ACLs are done as a sporting injury. It could be a work injury too. So, and they might be an athlete, an amateur athlete that has other sort of physically demanding work. So, working the rehab and the assessment in around that.
Let's talk about upskilling in ACL injuries specifically, and the work you guys are doing with Learn.Physio. So how did it start? Let's go back briefly. How did Learn.Physio start? So that's a company that you both co-founded, and you've got thousands of followers online. A lot of people will be familiar with it if they're interested in ACL injuries or musculoskeletal rehab. How did you start, and what's happening now, and where's it going?
Well, it started off the back of Mick and I doing the Melbourne ACL Rehabilitation Guide 2.0, where we got asked often to go and do talks. And, I've been busy with other things, and, Mick's got a young family, busy clinician, and we kind of spoke about it and said, listen, we just don't have time to kind of do the course circuit, for a better word. So we had an idea that we'd actually film a masterclass online and put it online. We thought that what we'd do is get an athlete to actually demonstrate some exercises, and we'd also get some professional footage of like assessment techniques and that type of thing, and actually film it in a nice location with a nice backdrop as well. So it was engaging to watch, and it was useful to watch as well. So Mick and I recorded the first ACL masterclass, would have been about 3 years ago now, Mick, I think, and we put it up online, really just kind of servicing a need, really. And we put it up on this little website that wasn't ours, called Learn.Physio, and it just started to sell well. And then the guy who actually owned the website gave us a call and said, do you want the website? It's like, what do you mean? How much do you want? And we were both not looking for any kind of additional kind of businesses or anything at that stage. But he said, listen, you can just have it for free. You guys will do better with it than I have, and I've got these other projects. So essentially we inherited Learn.Physio. We had our ACL masterclass up on there, and then we filmed a couple of additional masterclasses. And it just started to gain traction. And I suppose, Mick, we haven't looked back since.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was very fortuitous how it all came about. But that's been a great journey, and we've just released our brand new revised upgrade and brand new 6-part series that's bigger and better and more experts, and not just the Mick and Randall show anymore. It's we're trying not to really we that's a big part of what we want to do, is really call upon the experts to share their wealth of information. Like, it just wouldn't feel right to us to also run a shoulder course or an ankle masterclass or a hamstring masterclass. That's why we've also reached out to true industry experts and health professionals. We're lucky, when I was living in Melbourne, but you guys are still there. But, Melbourne's got such a wonderful talent pool of experts, in Melbourne. Not just Australian-based experts, but world experts in their chosen field. So, that was a big part of our growth as Learn.Physio, is to really reach out to these experts and get them to present and share their wealth of information to the students. So, feel very lucky about the journey so far, and can't wait for more stuff that's coming our way.
Well, that's a taster for listeners. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Randall. I was going to say we're out of time, but let's go.
No. I was just going to say, you're an educator as well, Luke, and it's an interesting time to be in. The pandemic has accelerated online, education remarkably. We weren't predicting the pandemic to kind of come along. And, I think that now more and more people are looking to do some form of education online. But, taking my Learn.Physio hat off and just putting my clinician's hat on, and going back to what we spoke about in the other episode as well, is that this is a piece of the puzzle. I don't think anyone can just completely learn online and just kind of absorb what we've got, even though we've got great people. you still need to get your hands dirty. You still need to learn from others face to face. You still need to kind of make sure that, like you're working in an environment that is making you accountable, and you're learning some of those soft skills as well. So I think that's a really important point that I wanted to make.
So good. Such value here. This is really just the start of a discussion. I've got so many more questions I want to ask you. I also don't want to run you late for your appointments that are coming up. So we better finish it there. I'm going to add links to all the questionnaires and everything you've mentioned there in the show description. We should also mention your podcast, Randall. So Journal Club, which is started in the same week as Physio Foundations, which was really nice. And then Mick's associated blog, Mick's 2 Cents, which summarizes the Journal Club episodes. So listeners, go check that out and subscribe to that. It's really worth getting a summary each week of an interesting journal article. Any final thoughts, guys, on ACLs before we wrap it up?
I think the ACL is just an evolving area. And I'm really excited to be part of sharing that research and trying to translate it to clinical practice to make sense of the stuff that comes our way. Like I think if you look at how many papers are published every month on ACLs, and it'd be in the hundreds, if not thousands, depending on the journals that you're sort of looking at. But it's such a huge topic. Largely, a lot of the things they look at, though, are very surgical driven, and I've loved to see in the last couple of years the emergence of a non-operative and rehab only approach, which I can't wait to see more and more evolve over time, and to allow us to make really confident decisions about the management of our ACL patients. And the even more recent emergence of the potential for the ACL to heal is just fascinating to me, and I can't wait to see more of that research come along over these next 10, 15, 20 years as well, because that's an absolute game changer that we're seeing. It's just these sprinklings of papers that are a bit retrospective when they look at it, but there's going to be some prospective trials evolve no doubt in the future that will give us an idea of who these lucky ACL healers are, and how we can hopefully identify them in the clinic, or via MRI or whatever means necessary to give these people a chance of rehabbing alone without surgery, and just giving them time to show that they can rehab and get a great result without surgery too. So that's the exciting stuff that I love, that wakes me up every day and wonders, what's the latest on PubMed, what can I sink my teeth in today, kind of stuff. So the next 5, 10, 15 years are going to be pretty cool, I think, in the ACL space.
And Randall, any final thoughts while we wrap this thing up?
Oh, no, just echo what Mick said. And the other thing is that, I think that there's so much focus with ACLs on just returning the player back to sport. But, the Latrobe group do an excellent job. And I know you're in the space as well, Luke, about looking at the long-term consequences, and particularly osteoarthritis in the long term. We know that most people will get arthritic change 10 years after having an ACL, and maintaining and protecting people's long-term health, I think, is just as important as getting them back out on the football field. So for people who are interested in that area, I'd encourage them to look at that space as much as they do kind of returning people just back to play.
Fantastic. All right. And Zuzana, final thoughts?
No final thoughts.
Final thoughts. All right, let's leave it there. Mick, Hughes, Randall Cooper, we really appreciate your time, and I'm sure the listeners do too. So much more to talk about next time. Let's leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on Physio Foundations and sharing your expertise.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for
welcome, Luke. Yeah, and looking forward to the next one.